3.
The Cell Membrane Video by Josh and Rishabh. Starting off, we have a special type of lipid called a phospholipid. A phospholipid is amphipathic, meaning it has both hydrophilic and hydrophobic properties. In the case of the cell membrane, a phospholipid has a hydrophilic head that attracts water and a hydrophobic tail that repels water. The head is made of a phosphate group, which is connected to a glycerol molecule, while the tail is made up of 2 fatty acid chains. These phospholipids arrange themselves into a double layer, which is commonly known as the phospholipid bilayer.
In this bilayer, the phospholipid head faces outwards, interacting with the environments both inside and outside the cell. Meanwhile, the phospholipid tails cluster together in the center, avoiding water, creating a barrier that helps control the movement of substances across the membrane. This is what makes the membrane selectively permeable.
Within the cell membrane, there are different types of proteins, each serving its own important purpose. Some proteins are permanently attached to the membrane, which are called integral proteins. And some integral proteins can sometimes span the entire membrane, in which they are called transmembrane.
One type of transmembrane protein is the channel protein. These proteins form passages that allow specific molecules to move across the membrane, helping the cell maintain balance in its environment. Another key transmembrane protein is the protein pump. These use energy to actively transport molecules across the membrane, usually against their concentration gradients. While integral proteins are located within the membrane, peripheral proteins are attached to the surface, either on the inside or outside. They can form hydrogen bonds with the phospholipid heads or integral proteins. Peripheral proteins often play a role in signaling or help maintain the cell shape.
Another important component of the membrane is cholesterol, a type of lipid molecule. Cholesterol can be found throughout the phospholipid bilayer. Cholesterol helps maintain the fluidity of the membrane, making sure it stays flexible across different temperatures. It acts like a stabilizer, preventing the membrane from becoming too rigid or too fluid.
Now let's talk about glycoproteins. These are proteins that have carbohydrates attached to them, and they stick out from the cell membrane. Glycoproteins are crucial for cell recognition. Similarly, glycolipids are lipid molecules with carbohydrates attached to them. They also play crucial roles in maintaining the stability of the cell membrane and helping with cellular recognition, which is important for the immune response and cell signaling. The intracellular space refers to anything located or occurring within the cell, which you can see on the bottom. The extracellular space refers to anything located or occurring outside the cells, which you can see on the top.
And so, now that we understand the parts of the cell membrane, let's go over a few of its functions. The cell membrane has a wide variety of functions, most of which are carried out by proteins. An example of this, which you can see here, is junctions. Cells can't work alone. They need to work with other cells in order to be successful, specifically to create cellular tissue. The cell membrane uses junctions to be able to do this. Junctions are defined as regions of the cell membrane where cells connect with each other or with the extracellular matrix. A common form of junction, which is shown here, is the tight junction. These form a seal between cells, keeping things from leaking between them. Tight junctions are important in places like the intestines, where they stop digestive juices from leaking into other parts of the body, and in the brain, where they stop unwanted agents from entering it.
Next, we have enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that speed up chemical reactions, and many of them are located within the cell membrane. One example is receptor tyrosine kinases, or RTKs. These are enzymes that act like a switch on the surface of a cell. When a molecule from outside the cell links to an RTK, 2 RTK molecules come together and turn on. This sends signals into the cell telling it to grow and divide.
Now, let's talk about transport. Cells need nutrients, ions, and gases to survive, but the membrane controls what comes in and out. And there are several ways in which the things that the cell needs can enter the cell. The first way is through passive transport. This type of transport doesn't need energy. It's like rolling downhill. Molecules move from high concentration to low concentration. And there are a few types of passive transport. The first is simple diffusion. This is when smaller things such as ions, molecules, or atoms can simply diffuse through the cell membrane into the cell without the assistance of proteins. There's also facilitated diffusion. For larger or charged molecules, transport proteins create passageways into the cell. It's like a door letting them in. And lastly, we have osmosis. Osmosis is the passive movement of water molecules across the semi-permeable membrane, from a region of low solute concentration to a region of high solute concentration. In contrast to passive membrane, there's active transport, where the cell uses energy to move molecules against the concentration gradient. An example of active transport is bulk transport. And there are 2 main types of bulk transport, endocytosis and exocytosis. Endocytosis is the process by which large molecules enter the cell, where they are surrounded by a vesicule formed by the cell membrane. Exocytosis is the opposite, where large molecules or waste products exit the cell by being surrounded by a vesicle and then released outside the cell.
Cells also need to recognize each other, especially in complex systems like the immune system. Cell recognition happens through special molecules on the surface of the membrane. These molecules, usually glycoproteins or glycolipids, as mentioned before, act as identifiers. For example, in your immune system, cells use these identifiers to distinguish between known and foreign cells. Other uses for cell recognition include cell adhesion, cell-to-cell communication, and tissue formation.
Next, let's talk about anchorage and attachment. Cell membranes are attached to both the structures inside the cell and the environment outside. These connections are critical for maintaining cell structure and communication. And so, inside the cell, membrane proteins attach to the cytoskeleton, giving the cell its shape. Outside of the cell, proteins can bind to the extracellular matrix, which provides support.
Finally, let's look at signal transduction, the process by which a cell uses an external signal, converts it into specific internal response. Essentially, this is how cells talk to each other. Here's how it works. A molecule, like a hormone, binds to a receptor on the membrane. This binding is the start of many events inside the cell. One example is the G protein coupled receptor, or the GPCR. When a molecule binds to it, the receptor activates a G protein, which then sends messages to the cell. These messages tell the cell to respond, for instance, by increasing your heart rate in response to stress. That was our summary of the parts of the cell membrane and its functions. We hope you enjoyed.